Welcome back, everyone, to part 6 of our look at the English Civil War. This is going to be the Battle of Preston. This is the battle that seals the fate of King Charles I. Hopefully they'll give some of the background as to what happened in between our previous episode and this one, because now we're transitioning from what would be called the First English Civil War to the Second English Civil War. And if they don't, I'll try to fill in the gaps a little bit, but I think they'll probably talk about that. They usually do talk a lot about the backgrounds. As always, a link is in the description all the way back to the beginning of this series and also to the original content, so you can watch it without my commentary. Let's dive into the Battle of Preston, 1648.
Throughout history, the failure to conclusively deal with a defeated enemy leader often resulted in renewed bouts of violence. Of this revanchist phenomenon, there is perhaps no greater example than the English Civil War.
Yeah, there are other examples of this, examples where, it seems to us in looking back, especially at this time of monarchy, it seems cruel, it seems excessive to us that they would execute their enemies after battles in many cases. But this was a necessary part of things, because if you defeated your enemy but let him live, he very often came back again, or people fought on his behalf. So almost always when you see a monarch deposed, that monarch ends up dying a violent death one way or another. And it doesn't necessarily happen the first time, because human nature is to not want to go to that extreme, right? So when Richard II is first overthrown, he isn't immediately killed. When Edward II is first overthrown, he isn't immediately killed. Henry VI, Lady Jane Grey. These are all examples of people around whom further revolts would rise up, threats to the new regime. In Richard II's case, Henry IV becomes king. In the case of Henry VI, you've got Edward IV. And Henry VI gets defeated a couple of times and he's allowed to live. But after it keeps on happening over a period of years, finally you're like, we've got to get rid of the source of all of these rebellions. If they don't have a person to rebel on behalf of, they're less likely to rebel.
After a promising start, the forces of King Charles had been outmatched in battle after battle until finally, in June 1645, the core of the Royalist army was irredeemably broken at the Battle of Naseby. However, despite suffering this string of crushing losses, Charles still resolved to continue fighting, motivated by a sincere belief in a monarch's divine right to rule. The subsequent flurry of events that followed would eventually result in the Second English Civil War and its conclusion at Preston. After its crushing defeat at parliamentarian hands in Northamptonshire, the Royalist cause in England began spinning into complete freefall. Although the king realised that his prospects were grim, he still had a few thousand good cavalry,
And not only that, remember, there are more than two sides in this war. There are multiple factions, and we've talked over and over again about how the enemy of my enemy can be my friend, but then once the enemy's gone, you turn on each other. And it's that vacuum, that uncertainty about what was going to happen after Charles was defeated that gives Charles, in his mind, an opening to go back after this. And they're all going to fight over who has the king, because they still believe that the king represents authority. And so they're like, oh, I want the king. No, I'll take the king. That kind of thing.
Which he quickly travelled to the Welsh border, where there was faint hope of reinforcement. Back in the Midlands, and fresh from recapturing Leicester on June 18th, Fairfax didn't bother pursuing Charles, instead marching towards Taunton. There, the last fully constituted Royalist field army, about 9,000 strong and under Goring's command, was besieging the city. Receiving word that he was about to be attacked by the superior New Model army, Goring lifted the siege and attempted to withdraw towards Bridgewater. Unfortunately for this ardent kingsman, Fairfax was too quick and engaged him at Langport on July 10th, destroying the final Royalist field force. If the destruction of Goring's army and Parliament's subsequent occupation of the West Country wasn't bad enough, Fairfax then marched north to snare Bristol, the king's last great manufacturing hub and prime gateway to Ireland. In the aftermath of Naseby, Charles valued the city's security so much that the illustrious Prince Rupert, demoralized but still fiercely loyal, was appointed its governor and ordered to keep it against the enemy at all costs.
Prince Rupert's so fascinating because there's so many times that it seems like he's doing really well, and then you're like, oh, that was dumb. You know, some people are go big or go home type people who can have really great successes and then really embarrassing moments too. Rupert seems to be one of those guys.
So confident was he that assurances were given to the king that Bristol could hold until at least Christmas. However, not even the man who was arguably Charles's foremost commander could withstand Fairfax's momentum. After a miserable siege of just 18 days, a hopeless Rupert surrendered Bristol on September 10th in return for mercy and an escort back to Oxford. When the king got word of the prince's abandonment of Bristol, he was utterly distraught. In response, a royal letter of condemnation was penned, containing, among other things, "What is to be done after one who is so near to me, both in blood and friendship, submits himself to so mean an action?"
This just goes to show you how superior at this point the new model army is in terms of their tactics, their abilities, their leadership. They're just pretty much, at least for Charles's forces, unbeatable on the battlefield.
For the Royalists, the bad news just kept on coming. Only 3 days after the betrayal of Bristol, as conspiratorial Royalist courtiers dubbed it, news reached Oxford that the Marquis of Montrose, Charles's singular ray of hope in Scotland, had been defeated at Philiphaugh with the loss of his entire army. Although the Marquis continued to cause trouble, there would be no salvation from the north. Increasingly deprived of options, the king marched north in an attempt to relieve Chester, the hypothetical landing point for any Irish Confederate soldiers who might come to aid him. He arrived on the 23rd, but was quickly bested in battle and forced.
You have to ask yourself at this point, what is Charles's endgame here? He's losing battle after battle. He's bouncing from one supposedly safe haven to another. He's running out of options.
To withdraw back to Oxford via Newark. The following months were an extended litany of bitter disappointment and failure among the Royalist partisans. Though there were no major battles which took place, garrisons fell one by one until by early 1646, Parliament controlled most of the country. Fearing for his son and heir's safety, Charles sent the Prince of Wales to France at around this time.
Good idea.
The final act of the First Civil War played out at Stow-on-the-Wold on March 21st, when new model units under Richard Brereton intercepted and defeated a 3,000-strong Royalist contingent moving back south to reinforce Oxford's skeleton garrison. Some of the cavalry managed to break out of the trap and reach Charles's position, but the army's commander, Lord Astley, and the majority of its Welsh levies capitulated without much resistance. As he was led off the field, Astley turned to his men and said, "You have done your work, boys, and may go play, unless you will fall out among yourselves." With the armies closing in all around Oxford, Charles slipped out of the city with only 2 companions and went north. For months, covert negotiations under French supervision had been taking place between the king and the Covenanters, who were deeply unsatisfied with their treatment by Parliament.
Remember, what do the Covenanters want? They want recognition, official state recognition of their religion. And that includes having that recognition in England as well. And so that's their main bargaining chip in all of this with the king, is that if the king is going to be restored, they'll support him if he'll support their cause.
Having received promises that he would be treated honourably and would not be forced to do anything which troubled his conscience, Charles entered Levin's camp at Newark on May 5th and was taken prisoner. The king now had protection in custody, while the Scots had an invaluable piece on the chessboard.
Remember what I said. This is still a time when people view possession of the king as possession of authority. If I have the king, I'm in charge. And he's going to get bounced around a little bit because of that.
Keep him secure, they moved back to Newcastle on the 13th. At about the same time, tension between the King's jailers and the English Parliament were reaching a fever pitch. On August 12th, the committee of both kingdoms' Scottish commissioners informed their counterparts that although the war was won, they were only prepared to withdraw their army from northern England if the £1.8 million they were owed as compensation was paid. The quickly splintering factions managed to reach a financial settlement, but it was clear that, above even this, the Covenanters were furious at Parliament's disregard of the Solemn League and Covenant. Rendering the Scots' war aims even less plausible was the failure to convert the captive king to Presbyterianism, or at least to agree to impose it on his kingdom as Parliament had promised before.
That's their overarching goal, right? They're not concerned about royal authority. They're not concerned about who's in charge. They want their religious aims to be dealt with. And if the king's not going to give it to them, he's not much use to them.
The king's sheer obstinance and repeated plots to escape eventually made the Scots believe that he wasn't worth the trouble. On January 28th, they agreed to sell Charles to the English Parliament in return for instalments of outstanding payments totaling £400,000. With that done, the Scottish army began withdrawing back to their own country, and
so, again, Scotland and England are both under the king, but they're still separate governments. They're separate countries. So that's why you have this negotiation going on between two different countries, both of whom call Charles king.
Demobilizing after almost half a decade at war. The king, meanwhile, was transported to house arrest at Holdenby, repeatedly being met by cheering crowds on the way. In London, Parliament was not the strong, relatively united faction which had managed to win the Civil War. Instead, without Charles as a strong enemy to come together against, the rift between the Presbyterian moderates and the more radical independents grew dangerously wide.
This is the story of history, right? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Look at how many times in history a nation has been united by a common threat, by a common enemy. Once that enemy's dealt with, now we focus on each other. Man, look at the aftermath of 9/11. How united the United States was, how Republicans and Democrats were on the same side. President Bush had like a 90% approval rating because everybody was focused on the people that had wronged them. They weren't worried about Democrat and Republican. They were worried about 9/11. As time went on and that wore off, then you start turning against each other again.
In late February and early March, members of the Presbyterian faction, who generally sought accommodation with the king, were busy shooting themselves in the foot by unilaterally disbanding the New Model Army's infantry regiments, which were often led by independents. To make the slight even more cutting, this was to be done without payments of outstanding wages that the troops were owed. The army had a number of other motivations, including the politics espoused by a group of aspiring egalitarians known as levelers. They believed that the army's anti-royalist triumph was to herald a new age of equality and the elimination of wealth and privilege. Squabbling within Parliament continued for the next few months.
So keep in mind, these guys are going to be the extremists, right? They're pushing for radical reform to come as a result. Hey, we fought this war anyway. We might as well make major change come of it. The problem is a lot of the very same leaders who won this war against Charles are also privileged and wealthy, and they're not exactly ready for a level playing field for everybody.
Until now relatively neutral Oliver Cromwell, who was both a prominent MP and an equally prominent New Model Army commander, began realizing his position was unsustainable. Amidst rumors of a Presbyterian plot to seize the king and use him for their own political ends, Cromwell probably condoned the dispatch of an arch-agitator known as George Joyce to Holdenby at the end of May, tasked with taking the king into his own custody. On the morning of June 3rd, Charles I walked out of Holdenby House and set off for Newmarket, accompanied by Joyce's troopers. There, the politically neutral Sir Thomas Fairfax and his New Model Army were gathered, and the army's mood was growing more restless. In London, the revelation of Charles's military apprehension gave Cromwell the excuse he needed to cross his own personal Rubicon. Quitting Parliament entirely, he rode north to personally lead the new model army, with whom he was incredibly popular. When Cromwell and Charles first met for talks, relations were actually quite cordial, contrary to what later events would imply. The parliamentary cavalry general even informed a friend that the king was the uprightest and most conscientious man of his 3 kingdoms.
So, it begs the question then, what changed? Well, what changes is that at this moment, Charles is in a very submissive place, right? He's in a place without power, without really much in terms of negotiating. So Cromwell is going to tend to feel a little more generous in that situation. But as soon as war breaks out again, all bets are off.
Behind the scenes, however, Charles continued his clandestine communications with the Scots, aiming to keep all his options open. For the time being, Cromwell and the army had other problems to distract them. At the end of July 1647, riots, sparked by the continuing wartime tax rate, spiraled out of control in the English capital. The violence led to a number of independent MPs fleeing to the army's protection, including the Speaker of the House.
So the very thing that led to all this in the first place, taxation and people's unwillingness to cough up the money for Charles, now leads to issues with the new model army and Parliament. Same problems.
By the Speaker's presence in their camp, Fairfax and Cromwell led the new model army into London and put it under military occupation. When the situation was considered safe, the king was escorted from Newmarket and installed at Hampton Court, where the imprisoned monarch still doggedly refused any settlement which wasn't entirely on his terms. Instead, Charles hoped that the obvious divisions between the various parliamentary factions could be widened and exploited for his own ends.
So, on one hand, you have to give credit to Charles. He's sticking to his principles that he held from the very beginning. Divine right of kings, his authority. He's not backing down. He's not compromising on any of those things. But on the other hand, there's a miscalculation here. And that is that he thinks he can exploit this instead of giving them reason to unite again, right? The whole point is that now he's not there as an enemy for them to fight, so they're focused on each other. But as soon as you try to exploit that, you give them that enemy again, and you actually unite. You have the opposite impact.
That political strategy initially seemed to be working well, when on October 18th, 5 leveller officers presented the army grandees, led by Lord General Fairfax, with the case of the army truly stated. This was a revolutionary manifesto calling for radical reforms, including but not limited to the dissolution of Parliament and the implementation of a new constitution, which would give all the freeborn the right to vote. So that disruption in the new model army could be avoided, Fairfax opened the so-called Putney debates to address the issue.
So they're like, hey, we want to have everybody given the right to vote. And the small number of people who currently have all that power are going to be like, yeah, but we kind of like being able to determine this stuff ourselves.
Although Cromwell's rejection of such a constitutional change decided the issue, the anti-monarchical nature of the discussion reached and frightened the king. Fearing for his safety, or just sick of being cooped up, Charles escaped in late November and eventually ended up at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, in an even less favourable imprisonment than before. If this irritation wasn't enough to harden Cromwell's attitude towards the king, the more severe intelligence that he was receiving certainly was. Just after Christmas 1647, Charles I secretly signed an agreement with the Scots, known as the Engagement, a military alliance between the king and his northern realm, in return for state-enforced Presbyterianism.
There you go.
After much debate at the Edinburgh Assembly, those royalists who became known as the Engagers gained a majority, and on April 20th, 1648, issued a declaration which accused the English Parliament of breaking the previously established Solemn League and Covenant. It also demanded uniformity of religion and the complete disbandment of the new model army, which the Scotch considered to be the most troublesome piece on the chessboard. This was completely impossible for the English, and so only a week later, the engagers began mobilizing for war against their recently dismissed ally.
So why are they opposed to the new model army? Well, it's a standing army, and at this time in history, that was viewed as an act of tyranny to have a standing army that you could just use whenever.
But this time, however, Parliament and its renegade army were already dealing with the embers of unrest in England. In late March, a spontaneous revolt in support of the king had broken out in Wales, led by Colonel John Poyer.
So you see what's happening here. Revolts are breaking out. They thought the war was over. Now it's happening again. This is why, second time around, they're going to deal much more harshly with the king. Even if the king had nothing to do with it. Lady Jane Grey was a teenage girl who was queen for 9 days and then deposed. And basically kind of left alone after that. She was imprisoned, but there was no thought to executing her. But then a few months later, a revolt breaks out on her behalf that she probably had nothing to do with. But that led to her execution, because you can't have an object for people to rally around over and over again.
However, it was quelled in short order by the swiftly moving Cromwell. Meanwhile, in the north of England, the efforts of revanchist royalist commander Marmaduke Langdale were limited due to the intervention of General John Lambert. This wasn't the end of Parliament's troubles. In late May, an overly draconian parliamentary commissioner in Kent provoked an uprising, which, while enjoying some success, was eventually confined within the city of Colchester, which was put under siege on June 12th. Although all of these revolts still posed a threat on their own, everyone on Parliament's side knew that an invasion from Scotland was imminent. As one of Charles's allies stated, "It is Scotland, and Scotland only can save the king and England. All others have their rise from the expectation of Scotland." The decisive campaign of the short Second Civil War was about to take place. The Royalist storm finally broke out on July 8th, when a roughly 10,000-strong Scottish army under the Duke of Hamilton crossed the border into northern England and linked up.
So the Duke of Hamilton is to this day still considered kind of the premier duke in Scotland. And I believe the current Duke of Hamilton's name is Alexander Hamilton.
With Langdale's 4,000 beleaguered rebels at Carlisle. With the tables turned by the presence of this new enemy, Lambert obeyed Cromwell's orders to withdraw to the safety of Barnard Castle after suffering some minor losses. This would allow for the preservation of the parliamentary army, while reinforcements made their way north to deal with the problem. Unfortunately for the Royalists, Hamilton was forced to call a stop to his offensive for 2 weeks, while supplies and reinforcements arrived from Scotland and Ireland. This gave Cromwell time to reach the area, and allowed the two parliamentary generals to meet at Wetherby on August 12th, forming a veteran army which totaled around 9,000 men. Unwilling to allow the invaders any opportunity to move further into the country, Cromwell sped westwards into Lancashire and down the Ribble Valley to intercept their southbound advance along England's west coast. To increase his army's marching pace, Cromwell chose to leave the parliamentarian artillery behind, having decided on an advance deeper into Lancashire to link up.
So we talked about this before, about how having a lot of artillery slows you down. So it's a calculated risk you're taking. You're thinking, okay, we right now moving faster is more important than having artillery. So you take a calculated risk and then you see if it pays off.
Up with potential allies in Wales, the bulk of Hamilton's Scots came to a halt atop Preston Moor at nightfall on August 16th. They set up for the night and prepared to cross the Ribble River in the morning, while most of the Scottish cavalry was sent ahead towards Wigan on a foraging mission. Langdale's force of around 3,000 foot and 600 horse, functioning as a cavalry screen east of the Main, coalesced about 4 miles northeast of Preston at Longridge. Due to inadequate reconnaissance, the King's supporters were completely unaware that Cromwell's 9,000 were only a few miles away, encamped at Stonyhurst Park. As the sun came above the horizon on August 17th, Hamilton ordered Bailey to begin marching the Scottish foot across the river. Shortly after this, a small probing vanguard from Cromwell's army started skirmishing with Langdale's surprised men on the road from Clitheroe. Believing that the entire parliamentary force was in the area, the Royalist general rode to Hamilton personally and informed him of the situation, but the latter was convinced to continue the river crossing by his officers. With minimal reinforcements to assist him, Langdale rode back to his embattled contingent. After hours of light skirmishing, he was finally attacked by the entirety of Cromwell's army in mid-afternoon. The battlefield was a disconnected mosaic of small fields, intersected by irrigation ditches, narrow lanes and high hedges, in which the crack new model infantry units had a distinct advantage over the freshly mustered greenhorns in the Royalist force.
So once again, you're proving the superiority of a professional fighting force. And this is why, for the next, till the present, England's going to have a small but professional army that it can call on for situations like this.
Nevertheless, Langdale's musketeers gave a good account of themselves, and at first managed to keep Cromwell's army at bay and avoid being outflanked. However, when fighting south of the Clitheroe Road was at its height, Lambert threw his Lancashire regiment at the sector and sent the Royalist screen routing towards Preston. Accounts differ as to what happened next, but all agree that the situation broke apart swiftly after Langdale's defeat. Hamilton was trapped in Preston trying to rally the last arrivals among his cavalry coming from the north, while the small earthwork defence around Ribble Bridge was quickly taken after some new model army marksmen captured an area of high ground overlooking it. Many Scots were killed before they could cross the bridge, but Hamilton managed to cross the river on horseback and joined the majority of his forces on the south bank. With Cromwell now blocking the road back to Scotland, the exhausted Royalists could only continue on south, where reinforcements would hopefully reach them.
But you're cut off from supply, you're cut off from communication with home.
Over the 3 days following the battle, the Scots, forced to leave behind their ammunition, were harassed constantly by Cromwell's Ironsides until they reached Winwick. There, the Scottish infantry was engaged and decimated by the veteran parliamentary footmen. Although the cavalry and leadership managed to escape, what remained of Hamilton's infantry surrendered on August 20th. At the other end of the country, an infuriated Fairfax brought the rebels in famine and disease-stricken Colchester to the negotiating table on the 27th. He was not in a merciful mood, and had Sir George Lisle and Sir Charles Lucas, defiant royalists until the very end, executed for bringing such unnecessary suffering onto the realm's innocents.
And like I said, this time around, okay, one time we can let it go. Happens again, you start chopping off heads.
Charles I was still imprisoned at Carisbrooke, but to the religious parliamentary soldiers, their former king had unjustly brought strife back to the land of England, even after God's will had resulted in his defeat during the First
Treason
War.
is what they're going to call
Therefore,
this.
Charles was guilty of disregarding the Lord's will and deserved no mercy. For this crime against his own people, Charles was dubbed the Man of Blood, and many radicals began to clamour for harsh punishment. A famous passage, drawn from Numbers 35:33 in the King James Bible, started being echoed as an example. "So ye shall not pollute the land wherein ye are, for blood it defileth the land, and the land cannot be cleansed of the blood that is shed therein, but by the blood of him that shed it." Although the suffering of Charles's realms was far from over, the king himself had run out of time. Our series on the English Civil Wars will continue, so make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see.
So the next part is actually going to be something that takes place after Charles's execution. We will take a look at that, but if you would like to see a deep dive into what follows this as far as the trial and execution of King Charles, we did that series from Historia Civilis, which is fantastic and really shows the details of how it all went down. So I'll throw a link up on the screen if you want to check that series out. Thanks for watching.